rhinestone encrusted face. Do you like my lamb?
I do. Now let's get back to work.
Hello everybody and welcome to English 332. I am your host, Professor Matt Cohen, and this, my friends, is the birth of the American novel. Today, we are talking about Lydia Maria Child's book, Hobomok. Alright, you will notice on the opening slide that my office hours are on there. Come see me. If you don't want to come see me, Skype me. Set up an appointment with me. I'm looking forward to it. Here we go. Richard Slotkin. He's an American literary critic. You can turn to your first slide. Here's a quotation from his magisterial book, 3 volumes. It's incredibly long. It's called Regeneration Through Violence. Great title. It's a literary history of North America, from colonial times to almost the present. And he writes this about the founding myth of the United States, a myth that is still very powerful today. He says, in American mythogenesis, the founding fathers were those who tore violently a nation from the implacable and opulent wilderness, the rogues, adventurers, and land boomers, the Indian fighters, traders, missionaries, explorers, and hunters who killed and were killed until they had mastered the wilderness. Now, Slotkin was writing during the Vietnam War, and he connected frontier mythology to what he called the murderous violence of our foreign policy. We continue to regenerate ourselves through violence against others, as Europeans have since they first settled North America. Slotkin's study reminds us that American mythology is founded on an exaggerated, fictional contrast between us and them, what he calls racial, religious, and cultural opposition of the American Indians and colonial Christians that originated in hostility toward those who controlled the resources that settlers wanted for themselves, especially land, of course. Our first American mythology, according to Slotkin, was one in which our hero was the captive or the victim of devilish American savages, and in which his or her heroic quest was for religious conversion and salvation. I'll leave it to you to decide who this myth is being used to demonize today. For Slotkin, this thesis applies to all of American literature. He says it lurks behind every single novel, every single poem, every single work that talks about America, focuses on it. So we might ask ourselves, does it apply to Hobomok, which is, after all, a novel about religious settlers negotiating with, sometimes fighting with, indigenous Americans? It depicts those founding fathers, right? Those settlers and Indian fighters. Now, in reading this book, we have stepped a few decades forward from the time of Charlotte Temple to a book published in the 1820s. And now the United States is on more solid foundations. It's more desperately searching for something like a national culture. It's less worried about not any longer being a country. After all, it was pretty weak in its original years. But it was still not really distinct from Great Britain. Folks still had family ties there, everybody spoke the same language, of course. So, for many Americans, what was missing was a kind of long and mythical past that they could draw on, to say that they were special, different from other countries, and that they were on a path that was different from the rest of the world. The novels of this time period, and Hobomok especially, take up that challenge of supplying that story by revisiting and revising the American past. If you look at your next slide, we've got a great picture of Lydia Maria Child sitting on her porch, reading. I'm going to talk a little bit about her first, and then we'll come back around to this novel. Child was a novelist, she was an activist, she was a poet, she was a home ec writer, she was a cookbook writer, a radical abolitionist, an anti-racist agitator, she was a journalist, she was a short story writer. Okay, you get the picture. This woman did it all. She was like the Oprah of anti-slavery at her time. Her career involved wild swings in popularity. What? I'm scared about the cat. I'm afraid the cat's going to attack me while I'm talking.
It happened.
Okay. This is a time, remember, when women writers are still just starting to be seen with some frequency in the literary marketplace. So the fact that she was writing at all was kind of a big deal. And she made lots of people happy with the novel Hobomok. It is written in the genre known as the historical novel. It is an early example of somebody writing a historical novel in American history. And the historical novel, it's important to keep in mind, would go on to be the most popular kind of novel in the 1800s, is still very popular today. It's a nationalist novel, Hobomok. It builds in those first few pages an epic history of American literature that had never existed before. That's quite a feat for just a few pages. At the height of her popularity, Child was getting massive circulation as a journal editor and writer. She was writing advice books that everybody would read for 25, 50 years. And she was bringing many people to the cause of abolition. But when she advocated publicly for the immediate emancipation of slaves, right, rather than gradual emancipation, for example, and more shockingly for the time, when she advocated for eliminating laws against interracial marriage, then things fell apart. She got shunned, people canceled subscriptions, she had crossed over a line for a lot of Americans who were still, at that time, profoundly resistant to the ideal of racial equality. So she's a patriotic writer, but being patriotic wasn't enough. She criticized her country's laws and its gender norms and its deeply held racial prejudices all in one package. If you look at the next slide, this is a title page from her book, The Freedmen's Book. The Freedmen's Book was designed to help newly emancipated slaves, note the publication date there at the bottom, 1865, to help newly emancipated slaves gain literacy and a connection to the tradition of writing about African American concerns in America and England, as writings by both African Americans and white folks, both English folks and American folks. And it was a very popular book. This is her activism. This is her not just writing about stuff, but actually trying to help people gain literacy and gain access to the means of equality. But at the same time, Child wrote some of the most nationalistic fiction of her era. Some of the most carefully crafted and absorbing fiction, absolutely, and with books like Hobomok, she invented whole new ways of thinking about the United States as a place with a long history. So there's a tension in her work that I think is going to be central to how we think about Hobomok and what it can teach us about the past. Now, it was a good time in the 1820s to be making an argument like this, because what was going on in politics was not so happy. It was dividing the nation in many ways. This was the reign of President Andrew Jackson. I didn't include a picture of him, sorry. You can look on your $20 bills. It was a time known as the Jacksonian era. This is about 1829 to 1837. Jackson was known as the people's president. He was uncouth, he was a war hero who was inclined to solve problems with weapons, he was anti-Native American, he was racist to the core. He was what some people today would call a strong leader, full of conviction. His candidacy, however, drew masses of people to political participation who hadn't been in it before. They came to believe in the Democratic Party in a way that hadn't really happened before. The mass machine politics of our time didn't exist back then. There just weren't the media devices to make it possible. This was one of the earliest eras in which you started to see politicians directly appealing to the people and attempting to reach out through newspapers and bring together the nation through an ideal that they normally had kind of tended to pursue through local means rather than thinking about the nation. People just weren't that worried about the presidency in the early days of the United States. They were really worried about their county, their town, and that kind of thing. So this is like the earliest sort of inklings of a political machine that could be imagined to be national. Many, many people got excited about his candidacy. He had charisma, he reached out to folks, and he was good at building ties among the party leaders. He wanted to get rid of the Electoral College, for example. He had a lot of popular positions. Then again, over the course of his lifetime, he owned about 300 slaves. He was a major land speculator, and his presidency was a nightmarish one for American Indians. The centerpiece of his Indian policy was his response to the landmark Supreme Court case Cherokee versus Georgia, which was decided in 1832. In this instance, state sovereignty was overruled in a jurisdiction dispute over who got to punish trespassers on Indian land. This was on a Cherokee Indian reservation in Georgia. And some white settlers had committed some depredations in Cherokee land. The court case was to decide who got to punish those guys. Was it going to be the Cherokees or was it going to be the state of Georgia? Now, it should have been a victory in a certain way, because the judge in the case decided that, in fact, the Cherokees did have sovereignty. It should have led to the Cherokees being able to do justice to wrongdoers in their own territory, but in reality it was a mixed result over the long term. Now, first of all, this decision put Native Americans under the care of the federal government instead of state governments. But in the same act, the argument was basically that because the federal government is the only entity that is able to negotiate relationships with tribes, which was the norm at the time and is still the norm, that meant that states couldn't interfere in the question of justice, in the question of interstate commerce, in the question of taxes, and so on and so forth. But the problem was that in order to make that argument, Chief Justice Marshall, who wrote this opinion, said that you had to think of Indians as being wards of the state, in effect, as being what he termed domestic dependent nations. So it was a trade-off for Indian sovereignty. You were sovereign to the extent that you were another nation, and yet you were subordinate to the United States. So, in response to this, Jackson simply refused to enforce the decision. He didn't send in federal troops. He didn't make the Georgians stay off of Cherokee land. And so in reality, nothing changed. There were more white incursions into what was supposed to be sovereign territory, and eventually the collapse of Cherokee self-determination in the end happened. Jackson's non-enforcement of the Supreme Court decision in Cherokee versus Georgia led 8 years later to the Cherokees having to depart for reservation land west of the Mississippi on a journey that we today call the Trail of Tears, on which thousands of Cherokees died, most of whom were elders, women, and children. Now, while many of these events happened after Hobomok was published, I want to keep in mind two things. First of all, the novel was wildly popular for a long time, and so people were still reading this novel while the Trail of Tears was going on. And the second is that these events, the rise of Jackson and the rise of this anti-Indian feeling, was the context in which Americans read Child's work and in which she was thinking about composing it. He was on her radar, and that's one of the reasons why she depicts American Indians in the kind of careful way in which she does in this book, for the most part. So, we'll take a step back, and we'll come back to the question of the indigenous presence in this novel in a minute. But why choose to write a historical novel instead of a romance or a didactic novel like Charlotte Temple? I mean, she could have just written Charlotte Temple, except in Indian territory, right? And told us what we should do. So why did she choose this route? So for that, once again, I think we have to turn from context back to questions of form, of why this form was so appealing. So let me say a little bit more about the genre of the historical novel. I'm going to do this by way of explaining the first page of the novel, the title page. If you look at your next slide, you will see the first title page from 1824 in the Boston edition of Hobomok. Notice right there, Hobomok, A Tale of the Early Times. Early Times, that tells you you've got a historical novel by an American. Doesn't have her name on the title page. So the whole question of did a woman write it, did a man write it, when it first came out, that wasn't on the table. She focalizes it on something other than her identity as a writer. But it's not just anonymous, right? It doesn't just not have a name on the title page. It's spectacularly written by someone who stands in for America in a way, or whose claim to authorship is grounded in nationality rather than in some other kind of identity. Remember, similarly but also differently, for example, Frederick Douglass's famous slave narrative was written by himself, and the himself was actually in the title, Frederick Douglass, an American slave. Later I'll return to what it means that this American is not American as in American Indian, but as in a U.S. citizen. Okay, so take a look at your next slide, because these are your big historical novelist figures. These are the folks that were on Child's mind when she said, okay, I'm gonna choose to write a historical novel. I'm competing with these guys, and I'm borrowing from them. On the left there, Robert Burns, whose poetry is often quoted at the start of Hobomok's chapters. Then Sir Walter Scott, who's there in the middle, an actual Scottish person like Burns. And then on the right, there's James Fenimore Cooper. All right, that's actually the awesome rocker Alice Cooper disguised as James Fenimore Cooper. Love the makeup. Whenever you get bored reading Hobomok, go back and, look on YouTube and check out some Alice Cooper videos. You won't ever forget them, for better or worse. Anyway, Burns, on the left there, is the best known of the poets who have written in the Scots language, although much of his writing is also in English, and he uses a dialect as well. He was one of the pioneers of the Romantic movement, a kind of high-class hippie reconnect with nature and your soul sort of movement. After his death, Burns became a great source of inspiration to the founders of both liberalism and socialism. His poetry is highly critical of social inequalities of all kinds, and that is why Child was attracted to him. He's a cultural icon in Scotland and among the Scottish diaspora. You all right over there?
Yeah, there's some woodpeckers over here I gotta check out.
Wow. Okay, this one is obviously not as riveting. Do you want to look at my picture of Alice Cooper? I want portraits of all leading American writers that are done like that. Yeah. And I want one of Lydia Maria Child, except it's Jenna Marbles. That's what I'm saying. A cultural icon in Scotland and among the Scottish diaspora throughout the world, the celebration of his life and work became almost a national cult during the 19th and 20th centuries. You'll see him being referred to by other writers later on this semester. Now, Walter Scott, there in the middle with his dogs, wrote a book called Waverley that changed the literary world forever. Have any of you read it? No. And yet every historical fiction and most romances draw on it. Waverley was one of the most read books in the 19th century, and everybody knew this book. They knew the Bible and they knew Waverley. And almost every novel that you read up through the 1920s has some sort of reference to it or some kind of debt to it for the kinds of innovations. Scott is inside your head and you don't even know it. This book is set during the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, and it tells the story of an idealistic young soldier who is sent into the Scottish territory during the war. Waverley shows the influence of the 18th century Enlightenment. This book suggests that every human is basically decent, regardless of class, religion, or politics, or ancestry. You just have to figure out how to connect with them in the right way. Now, Scott was the first novelist to portray rural characters in a really deeply sympathetic way, and yet at the same time realistically. Burns does this as well in his poetry, which was an important precedent for that, but Scott brought it quite boldly into the form of the novel. Waverley also conveys Scott's belief in the need for building social progress out of the traditions of the past. He was like, you can't just innovate. You can't just say, oh, we're going to leave the past behind. You have to remember those things that were good about it and that brought you a sense of continuity, a sense of traditions and morality, and then you can innovate. That was his kind of theory. So this was very appealing to Americans who were beginning to worry about whether their experiment was actually going to work out, whether just rejecting the English was in fact the way to go. There's a certain kind of love for England that Scott made it possible for Americans to articulate to each other through reading him. The French Revolution was the negative example for all of these people. We're going to cut off all their heads. It's kind of a symbol of cutting off a relationship to the past. Okay, and last, good old Alice/James Fenimore Cooper. He's the author of what are known as the Leather Stocking Tales. You know some of them, The Last of the Mohicans, perhaps, The Prairie, The Pathfinder. He wrote a novel called The Spy, which is referenced at the very beginning of Hobomok. Cooper, also a historical novelist, but his novels, as you may know, are set on the American frontier. They concern a character named Natty Bumppo. It's always good to have a good character name. Like, it's hard to forget, even if it's bad, you know what I mean? It's kind of like Dumbo, you know? Sorry. Leatherstocking was his nickname. That's what we like to call him, because it's easier than saying Bumpo. Who operates as a kind of go-between for Indian and white settler cultures. He's critical of everybody. He's a kind of grumpy old man, but he's also like a really good shot, so you can't with him, right? He draws on everybody's traditions too, Native Americans, white folks, whoever he's traveling with. He already seems to know where they come from and what their culture is like. Now, Cooper based much of his writing on, you guessed it, Sir Walter Scott, and he borrowed publishing tricks from the London literary marketplace from him too, how to amp up his work and kind of become a brand. He became, like Scott, an international literary powerhouse, one of the first for America. After Washington Irving, he was only the second American at that time to make a living publishing fiction. Oh, so in the next slide, there's a link, and I'm not a Russian hacker. That is there because if you need a different perspective from the endless religious debates that are happening kind of in the middle 40 pages of Hobomok, that there's a link that I think will please you to a routine by the comedian Emo Phillips. Okay, next slide. The great question of the historical novel and of dialect poetry like Burns's is this. How does one relate a local life, visible, embedded, immediate, personal? You know all these people around you. You see the same places every day. You go to your job. You worry about this sphere that you live in every day. How do you relate that local life to a national life, a national entity that's imaginary, is far away, is mediated by print, by newspapers, for us by television or the internet, or by taxes, by campaign speeches, platforms. Something that's designed to be impersonal, that's designed to be crowd-oriented, that's to appeal to the mass. How do you relate these two things to each other? Some say that the historical novel was so successful because it emphasizes local particularities. It zooms in on small towns and very specific places and times in the past. And then it's kind of framed by this highfalutin language, like we see at the beginning of Hobomok, right? It says, this seems like such a small community and no big deal, but actually it's the beginning of America. This characteristic of historical novels suggests that perhaps nation-states like the United States at this time, or Great Britain earlier in Scott's heyday, that they were still comparatively weak as national ideas. Historical novels help individuals imagine ways that they could belong to a nation, an invisible collective, an idea, something immaterial but meaningful. Help them feel like they share a past on which they can build a future. Distant historical times, they're safely isolated from the hot-button issues of the day, yet one can make an argument that implicitly every kind of historical novel addresses issues in the present as well. And they pose a kind of ideal instead of the messy, complicated reality that we have to deal with. Look, Hobomok says, we've all gotten over religious bigotry. And isn't that great? It's because, well, we're all American. And as my rephrasing there suggests, there's often a shell game involved. As the nation comes in, fully convincing, oh, that's the thing I'm going to invest in, some contradiction kind of has to be shoved under the carpet, especially if the nation's prosperity is based on taking land from one race and enslaving another. The Indians in Hobomok, unlike many others in fiction then and now, are real people who speak. We're allowed to see their thoughts, not just their stoic facial expressions. In movie westerns or Cormac McCarthy novels, they're unknowable, the Indians, the kind of people with whom you cannot negotiate. Indians start out evil and they die evil. They get no chance to be human and conflicted, as Hobomok is depicted to be in this novel. His character is drawn in contrast to the many negative images, the corbetants of American culture, of native warriors as abductors of women and murderers of children, like in these two images on your slide. These kinds of stories were endlessly circulated long after the frontier had moved 1,000 miles from most white folks, and those people didn't see Native Americans in their daily lives. The native was repeatedly constructed as warlike, unrelenting, inhuman, even as, at other times, he was depicted as a noble vestige of an earlier world. And this is one of the contrasts that Hobomok is built on. It seems as if, by turning back in time and using a fictional narrative, Child is trying to convince us that we have overcome certain problems with the treatment of Native Americans in history. Today's America would not be like the America of the past. But then again, consider what happens at the end of this novel. Hobomok is the title character. He's a hero. But he voluntarily bails from the scene when Charles Brown returns. He vanishes. Look at the next slide. It's a quotation that I think is crucial in this book. He vanishes, noble savage that he is. His conduct is all of a piece, Charles Brown says, having returned from the supposed shipwreck. Noble throughout. Yeah, lucky for you, buddy. He would have sent you back to the deep blue sea where everybody thought you were, right? But no, he voluntarily gives up, lets Charles Brown marry his wife, and disappears. The fantasy that Indians would just disappear, ideally voluntarily, but either way, because of their racial inferiority, their inability to control their passionate tempers, that stereotype appears very powerfully in this novel. This disappearing Indian act, this is one of the notorious memes of American literature. It's called the Vanishing Indian Myth. Take a look at your next slide, slide number 10. This passage in the book in which this happens. Without trusting another look, he hurried forward. He paused on a neighboring hill, looked toward his wigwam till his strained vision could hardly discern the object, with a bursting heart again murmured his farewell and blessing, and forever passed away from New England. He doesn't just disappear, he also blesses the new national project. This same thing, this same sort of ventriloquized, sort of made-up, generous Indian who will nonetheless evaporate from the scene, appears in paintings and plays and poems and so on. If you take a look at your next slide here are 3 images from the art world that have this same theme, one from 1845, one from 1908, one from 1920. The Indians keep disappearing over and over again, and yet they're still here. There's 2 million Native Americans in the United States right now, right? More than in a long time. So, in this case, we could take a look at that painting by Charles Dease there called The Death Struggle, right? You've got a trapper who's on his horse who's plunging over the edge of a precipice. He's holding on to some critter that's biting the Native American who's attacking him, right? This is a thing that was really bothering Americans at the time. How to relate to the continued indigenous presence and the fact that that presence pointed to a dark and bloody past that had helped create the United States. In the other images, the one on the top there is by Frederick Remington, who's a very famous painter. It's called The Last of His Race. The picture underneath it is a photograph by Charles Eastman, super famous photographer from the early 20th century. Guess what that photograph is called? The Last of His Race. I get annoyed by this. Sorry, I'm fine. This was a myth with power, though, because it convinced people who had never come within 100 miles of an actual Native American person that the United States' violent policies of dispossession, of cultural conversion of Native children through abduction and forced re-education in boarding schools, that these policies were not just necessary, but good. They were the best that things could get. The vanishing Indian story comforted people that the genocide happening on the United States' borders was not genocide, it was nature's way. It was God's intention. This is one of the most disturbing ways in which fiction, novels, poems, stories make reality. It is worth checking yourself, always, as you think about your assumptions about whole groups of people. Where did those ideas come from? Do they square with reality? Have you asked one of those people what they think about it? Calling the novel Hobomok, and indeed naming the mixed-race child of Hobomok and Mary that, centers the problem of the Indian, the problem of the American Indian. That is, the drama of the novel revolves around white attitudes toward Indians and the ways in which white communities are structured by those attitudes or divided by them. Hobomok is inside white community, in their heads and in their blood, even when he leaves. Because if you don't have the noble figure of Hobomok, you don't have a legitimate community. Your community is founded on difference and violence instead of on harmony and agreement. That the novel does not relinquish, even though it reassures its white readers that Indians are gone, or almost gone anyway, and their culture can be appropriated to white ends. It's not about Mary Conant, oddly enough, even though I think that her loving Hobomok is important, because Mary only breaks rules and puts the problem front and center thanks to her shallowness. She's not that much different from Charlotte Temple, in some ways, I would argue, and thus the title focuses on Hobomok and not on her is significant. What if Charlotte Temple had been called Montreville instead? We'll think of it that way. And then finally, that myth that Slotkin talks about the founding fathers fighting Indians and struggling against the beasts of the forest, right? That's one version of the American myth. The other is Pocahontas, right? Where the indigenous person jumps in and saves the life of John Smith, our prototype settler, right? Where there's a voluntary act of what looks like love. That's a founding act of love rather than a founding act of violence. Slotkin, I think, misses this opportunity to think about this being more complicated, and I think that's one of the things this novel actually draws on. This novel positions the Puritans and their interactions with Native people as the origin of the United States, not some kind of violent conflict as the beginning of it. Now, in theory, it says that the Native past is the source of the literary future of America. But in practice, it doesn't really acknowledge other regions' indigenous pasts or people, other colonial enterprises that were competing with the English in this same space, like the Dutch, the French, the Spanish. They're only kind of briefly alluded to. So this novel also implicitly participates in the building of a thing that is known as the Puritan origins thesis, as an integral part of its arguing something else, called the American exceptionalism paradigm. The notion that New England was the origin of the United States first, that the Puritans are where all of us came from, right? Even though many of us are descended from immigrants who came here long after the Puritans, African slaves who were brought here against their will, right? There's still this notion that somehow New England is like the heart of everything. And then that American exceptionalism, we're going to see this in a number of places going forward, and we'll also see criticisms of it. But that's the idea that the United States is destined to have a special path and become a leader in the world. It's destined to be a beacon for freedom and democracy and so on and so forth. Take a look at your next slide. This is the last line of the novel. But the devoted, romantic love of Hobomok was never forgotten by its object, and his faithful services to the Yankees are still remembered with gratitude, though the tender slip which he protected has since become a mighty tree, and the nations of the earth seek refuge under its branches. Well, they sought refuge under his branches until a couple of years ago, anyway. And what do we do, finally, with the contradiction between this racist message about natives and the positive message about women, and about the capacity of people with religious differences to get along? Consider the very end of the novel, how these religious differences that we've endured for 140 pages are suddenly no longer important. They just disappear. Your next slide. This is the scene where Mary Conant's dad makes up with Charles Brown, who he's had this fundamental disagreement with. They got him evicted from the colony because he's an Episcopalian, right? And then after this whole thing with Hobomok happens, everything is fine. Her father clasped her in a long, affectionate embrace, and never, to the day of his death, referred to a subject which was almost equally unpleasant to both. Charles Brown and Mary Conant were pronounced man and wife in the presence of her father and Dame Willett. Disputes on matters of opinion would sometimes arise, but Brown seldom forgot his promises of forbearance, and they were always brought to an amicable termination. Before the Indian came along and wanted to get with Mary, the amicable termination of conversations was impossible. Here is a fable of democracy. If we are to live in a land filled with dark others and religious enthusiasts, we need some agonistic process, or some sympathy, or some endless melancholy deferral, or some imaginary shared race-based trauma, whereby we can set aside our essentialisms and manage to make it through tough times and hard decisions. Because it could have been worse. It strikes me, though, that in many ways the women in this novel, certainly Sally Oldham, Mary to an extent, the older women who pass away before the end of this thing, they are the bearers of its modernity. They really are the bringers of the new, in a way. The men are all kind of stuck in the past and in their opinions. If there's a dramatization of a successful democratic agonistic debate at the end of this novel, it's brought on by women. So, in this novel, on the one hand, we have a familiar myth. We have an extension of the one that Richard Slotkin talked about, where the American identity is always premised on defeating some dark and primitive other or conquering the wilderness, and in such stories, it can be hard to tell the Indians from the trees. But on the other hand, we have a statement about the ability of democratic conversation and reasonable debate to overcome religious differences, one of the platforms of the United States Constitution, right? And moreover, we have a claim that women are central to that process. And you would, without even knowing that this book was written by a woman, that message comes through. So that anonymity with which it was published as a formal property does not stand in the way of the way in which the content of the book forces this recognition of powerful women characters upon you. This makes implicitly a strong claim for women as authors of novels that can embrace the United States' self-image and its reputation, but also for women as the critics, the new, better version of the Mr. Conants of the past, who can light the way to a happier and more reasonable future. But in the end, this revelation is only possible because Hobomok disappears, because Hobomok isn't that critic. Hobomok is the one who nobly says, all right, your civilization will take over. Because the specter of more racial mixing is the reason that Mr. Cohen ultimately agrees to silence his objections to Charles Brown. Nobody said making an American literature was going to be easy. And I'll just end with an example of how some critics in the 19th century reacted to this book, because they didn't always praise it. So if you look at your last slide, the author has an eye for the beautiful and sublime of external nature. There they are, those categories. They just never go away, right? This critic is saying that this novel, right away we know, we're saying this critic's saying this novel works at extremes. It's not in picturesque territory. It's not going down the middle. It's not comfortable. And a heart for the tender and generous traits of the human character. With all its merits, it has its defects, which prevent it from leaving upon the whole a favorable or pleasing impression. It's breaking that rule, right, to delight and instruct. We think it a fault in the plan of so short a work that it introduces so many characters and incidents not immediately connected with the main object. Okay, now you may agree with that, but note that the main criticism is this. To our minds, there is a very considerable objection to the catastrophe of the story, that is to say, that final turn of events. A high-born and delicate female, on the supposed death of her lover, has, in a fit of insane despondency, offered herself as the wife of an Indian chief, and has become such according to the customs of his nation. She lives with him 3 years, and an infant semi-savage is the offspring of the union. At the end of that time, her white lover returns. Her copper one, with great magnanimity, relinquishes her and departs, and she is married to the former. Now this is a train of events not only unnatural, but revolting, we conceive, to every feeling of delicacy in man or woman. For this critic, the racial mixing was just too much. The mere depiction of interracial marriage and reproduction was nauseating. On the other hand, this shows the power of novels, that they reach inside the most basic parts of our souls and they pull things out of the dark. On the other, it shows how limited that power can be with some readers. And in fact, this reader imagines that every single person reading this will be appalled, which was not the case, right? Many writers reacted to this paradox by taking the novel to even more astonishing, outrageous, and confrontational levels than it had ever gone before. One of those is George Lepard, whose novel, The Killers, we will be reading next time. You can tell from the title that it is not pulling punches. This is sensationalism at its most sensational. It is designed to wipe out those weakling critics and their prejudices and force a reckoning with social justice. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you, people. See you next time. Rhinestone encrusted face.